for the cell. So today, we're really going to focus in on those organelles. We're going to talk about a whole bunch of specific organelles that are found inside most animal and plant cells, and kind of talk about where they are and what they look like and what their main purpose is. What are these organelles doing inside of our cells? So, that's where we want to go. So we're continuing on with the same cell notes that we started going over on Tuesday. This is kind of the second half of the notes. So on Tuesday, we kind of covered like all this stuff with the cell theory and differentiation and kind of some basic background information about prokaryotes and eukaryotes. And then today we're going to focus on the organelles. Last time we kind of ended talking about these tiny little structures inside of the cells. So again, so humans have organs like stomach and intestines and liver and brain and heart that do all sorts of different jobs for our bodies. Cells have organelles that do various different jobs for the cell. These guys are all floating around in the cytoplasm, so that kind of jelly-like stuff that's filling up the inside of the cell. They're kind of floating there, usually in somewhat specific areas of the cell. Some of them have extra membranes that cover them, and some of them do not. So basically some of the main ones that we're going to be talking about today include the cell membrane around the edge here. Oh man, this picture got a little bit out of sync with its labels. But we have our cell membrane, our nucleus here in the middle, the rough and smooth endoplasmic reticulum kind of along that side, the Golgi, and the mitochondria. And also, it's not on here, but lysosomes as well. We'll get to those. Plant cells are pretty similar to animals, and we'll talk about some of their different organelles, which include things like a cell wall around the outside, a big storage vacuole in the middle, and some chloroplasts, where cells go through photosynthesis in order to make sugar, to make energy for themselves. All right, so the first major organelle that we're going to talk about is the cell membrane, also sometimes called the plasma membrane. So the cell membrane is composed of lipids and proteins. Sometimes you'll see it referred to as a lipid bilayer or a phospholipid bilayer, which is really just a fancy way of saying two layers of lipids. So remember, lipids are one of our macromolecules. They're made out of fatty acids. And our cell membranes are covered in thousands of lipids. So each one of these little circles with the two little lines coming out off of it is a single what's called phospholipid. So there are thousands and thousands of these guys that make this special layer around the cell. All cells on planet Earth have a cell membrane. Whether you're a prokaryote like a bacteria cell, or you're a plant cell or an animal cell or a mushroom cell, all cells have this plasma membrane, this lipid bilayer. So there's like a top layer and a bottom layer of lipids. And they're a special kind of lipid called phospholipids. So the most important job of the cell membrane is to protect the cell. It keeps the outside stuff on the outside and the inside stuff on the inside. We don't want anything just coming and going inside, outside of the cell all the time. That would be really, really bad for the environment, for the cell. So this membrane is the control of what goes in and what comes out. It's sort of like a border control for the cell. Only things that are supposed to can come in, and only things that are meant to go out can leave. Everything else is either kept on the outside or kept on the inside. So it's mostly made out of these lipids. There's also a couple proteins that we're actually going to be talking about next week, some of these different proteins and what they do for these cell layers. They are what help control what goes in and out. Most things, most like little macromolecules or atoms, cannot go through this lipid layer right here. They're blocked by these lipids. So these proteins act as sort of like bridges or channels where they're able to get through. And like I said, next week on Tuesday and Thursday, we'll talk a lot more about how these proteins work. But for now, just know that we've got these lipids and these proteins that are protecting the cell and controlling what goes in and what goes out. So some cells, like plant cells and bacteria cells, also have a cell wall. So the cell wall is on like the outside of the membrane. It's sort of like extra support and protection for the cell. So obviously, especially in plant cells, they need a lot of support because they're going to be going straight up and branching out of the ground, and the leaves and the branches and the stems and stuff are all going to be really tough and really supported. And some of that comes from all their cells have the cell wall. It helps give them extra structure, essentially. A lot of this stuff is not super important to know. So in plants and animal cells, it's just the cell membrane that is on the outside of the cell. And plant cells, they have the cell membrane, and then the cell wall is right on the outside of this. So this inner line that's kind of bordered by the pink cytoplasm is the membrane. And then this outer line right here is the cell wall. So the membrane goes right up to the edges of the cell wall in plant cells. The wall kind of is what helps give the cells their shape, which adds to their support. So all cells have a cell membrane, but only plant cells and some bacteria cells have a cell wall. So animal cells, like our cells, no cell walls in us. So one of the other things that we talked about when we talked about like the prokaryotes and the eukaryotes and the different things that all organisms have is the cytoplasm. The cytoplasm is just the filler material of the cell. It's this kind of watery jelly substance that's held in by the cell membrane. So the cytoplasm of all the different in your body that are smushed together, they're basically all separated by the cell membranes for each cell. So basically everything is floating around in the cytoplasm. The DNA, the organelles, the amino acids and fatty acids and simple sugars that we need to make things like carbohydrates and lipids and proteins, it's all floating around in the cytoplasm. There's also a whole bunch of enzymes in the cytoplasm that help make sure that these chemical reactions take place. So because the cytoplasm is there, the enzymes and the organelles, or the enzymes and the like little particles, the little amino acids and stuff, are all able to come together and do the chemical reactions that they're supposed to do. And remember, enzymes make chemical reactions happen faster, so they lower the amount of time that it takes for these reactions to happen. But all of these reactions inside of the cell are happening in the cytoplasm in here, in this sort of jelly-like filler material. All right, any questions so far on cell membranes or cell walls or cytoplasm? All right, so if not, we can move right along. Blah, 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 blah. All right, so the first major organelle that we're going to talk about is a big one, literally and like importance-wise, because it is the nucleus. So the nucleus is one of the defining factors of a eukaryotic cell, right? Prokaryotes, like bacteria, do not have a nucleus. Their DNA just sort of floats in the middle area. Eukaryotes, though, all eukaryotes have a nucleus. So the nucleus is like the control center. It's like the brain of the cell, essentially, because the nucleus has DNA. So your DNA is like the instruction manual for your body and for your cells. It contains all of the information that your body needs in order to function properly. So it's really, really important that we keep the DNA nice and safe and secured inside of the nucleus. So unlike in prokaryotes like bacteria, where the DNA is just kind of floating along, in eukaryotic cells, we keep it safe in the nucleus. So we'll talk more about DNA and chromosomes kind of at the end of the term, this term. But essentially, your DNA isn't just floating around here in one big, long string. It's separated up into different chunks called chromosomes. Depending on what type of animal or plant you are, you might have a different number of chromosomes inside your nucleus. And humans, and you and me, we have 46 total chromosomes inside the nucleus of every single cell in your body. So whether you're a skin cell, a liver cell, a muscle cell, a brain cell, you have 46 chromosomes inside of your nucleus. 23 of those are copies that we get from our mom, and the other 23 are the copies we get from our dad. So we have these 46 chunks of DNA called chromosomes, and they're all contained inside the nucleus right here. The nucleus is literally one of the largest deals in the cell. It's usually one of the few things that you can see inside of a cell if you're just looking at it through like a standard light microscope. All the other organelles are kind of too small to show up really well, but the nucleus you can usually see with the OK microscope. So like I was saying, our DNA is inside of our cells, and it's floating around as chromosomes, as these chunks of these segments of DNA. So again, DNA is the blueprint for your body and for your cells. It contains hundreds and hundreds of different genes. And genes are the code in DNA for proteins. So the way that we know what proteins to make in different cells is due to the code that's inside of our DNA. And like I was saying earlier, DNA is hereditary. meaning that you inherit all of your DNA from a combination between your mom's DNA and your dad's DNA. So all of the information to make you, all of that DNA code is all a mixture of your mom and your dad's DNA. It's not like something that's created brand new for you when you're first fertilized inside of your mom. It's passed down from generation to generation to generation. So our nucleus contains our DNA, and our DNA is incredibly important for our cells. Even a minor damage to our DNA can cause huge reproduction, huge issues for the body. So cells try to take really precautions and do a really good job of keeping their DNA safe and error-free. All right, anybody have any nucleus or DNA questions before we move along?
Nope.
Cool. All right, so up next is one of my personal favorite organelles in the cell, just because I think it has a cool name and it looks cool and it does cool stuff. They are called the mitochondria. So a single one is called a mitochondrion, but for the most part, your cell has several or even dozens of these. So in general, we just call them mitochondria. So the one thing that people seem to remember from their high school biology days is that mitochondria is the powerhouse of the cell. You may have even seen this. People were making memes about it like a couple of years ago, about how the only thing they remembered from science class is that the mitochondria is the powerhouse of the cell. And while it is kind of a meme, it's also a great way of explaining the mitochondria. So these guys are the energy plant for the cell. They are what are pumping out the energy that your cell needs. They're taking in the food that you eat and the sugars that you're getting from your carbohydrates, and they're turning that into energy. Specifically, a type of cellular energy called ATP. So ATP is like a high energy molecule that the cell uses in order to run, in order to function. And this ATP is made in the mitochondria, hence it being the powerhouse of the cell. So depending on a cell's activity level, they might have more or less mitochondria than other cells. Muscle cells, very active, do a lot of energy-related things. They tend to have more mitochondria in them, so they can keep up that energy for longer. Plant cells and animal cells have mitochondria. Most eukaryotic cells have mitochondria in them. So even though plants make their own energy from the sun, the way they do that is that they first go through photosynthesis to make sugar, to make glucose, and then they send that sugar to the mitochondria to be broken down into energy for the cell. So they use light energy from the sun, they convert it into sugar, and then they convert that sugar to cellular energy for the cell. And they get that cellular energy from the mitochondria. So the fancy scientific word for making energy is called cellular respiration. So normally if you think about respiration, you think about like the respiratory system, like your lungs and breathing oxygen in and out. This is a little bit different from that. Cellular respiration is how mitochondria make energy from sugar, essentially, from carbohydrates. And so if you go on and you take biology or biochemistry courses in college, like Mr. Stanley did, you have to learn all the exact steps and the exact chemicals that are involved in a single round of cellular respiration. For this class, though, all you have to know is that your mitochondria makes energy. It makes ATP for the cell to use as energy. So mitochondria are cool. They have this very distinct kind of round pill shape with all these different little folds and creases on the inside. So it's always really easy to tell what a mitochondria is in the picture of a cell. Mitochondria are kind of interesting. They have two membranes that go around them, an outer membrane that's like this dark brown one, and an inner membrane that's like this lighter brown one. There is a reason for that. We're not going to get into it in this class. It's a very complex biochemical reason, but it's kind of neat. Blah, blah, blah. I don't really need to know much about the membrane, so we're going to skip that. So one cool thing about mitochondria is that, I think it mentions, is that it has its own little mini section of DNA inside of the mitochondria. And this DNA, unlike the DNA in your nucleus, which is passed down from your mom's DNA and your dad's DNA coming together and making you, your mitochondrial DNA comes directly from the egg cell. So mitochondria are so important for creating energy that the egg cell that's produced by your mom starts creating mitochondria before it even gets fertilized by the sperm cell. So because of that, 100% of your mitochondria and the DNA in your mitochondria are inherited from your mom. So every single person has a direct line to their mom's mitochondria in their cells. So that means your mitochondria are more or less the exact same as your mom's mitochondria, which are the same as your grandma's, which are the same as your great-grandma's, which are the same as your great-great-grandma's, and so on and so forth back in history. So all the mitochondria in your cells are directly descended from the female line of your ancestors, essentially. Not super important to know, but a really cool, kind of interesting fact that I like to pass on to people. Mitochondria are so neat and so interesting. So again, mitochondria, powerhouse of the cell, the power plant for it. They take our glucose molecule. So remember, this is one of our simple sugars from when we were talking about the macromolecules, our little glucose here. And it turns this glucose molecule into ATP, which is this guy over here. It has a big fancy name. It stands for adenosine triphosphate. You don't have to know that. You just have to know it's called ATP, and it's what gives the cell energy. All right, any mitochondria questions before we move on to our next organelles?
No, thank you.
All right. So we've got our cell membrane covering and protecting the outside of the cell. We've got our nucleus, which has our DNA in it. We have our mitochondria, which is the powerhouse of the cell generating that ATP. Up next, we're kind of going to move into the realm of transport. So eukaryotic cells, to us, they're microscopic, but on a cellular level, they're relatively big, right? They're a lot bigger than those prokaryotic cells. But all of the little proteins and enzymes and amino acids and stuff that are floating around are still really small. So our cells have ways of moving these different molecules, these different biomolecules around the cell very efficiently. One of the things that does this is called the endoplasmic Reticulum. One of the craziest names you'll ever see in science. Obviously, that is a mouthful, and I'm not going to sit here and talk about endoplasmic reticulum for the next 5 minutes. So instead, scientists just call it the ER. Much simpler. Different from the George Clooney show in the 90s, though. Not the same as that. Different kind of ER. So the endoplasmic reticulum, the ER, is in your cells, and it comes in 2 flavors. We have our rough ER that has all these little bumps on it, and our smooth ER. So the ER is basically a whole bunch of these kind of hollow tubes that usually are in the cell pretty close to the nucleus. So a lot of times the ER connects directly to the nucleus, or the nuclear envelope, which is like the fancy name for the membrane that covers the nucleus. So it's like right there up against the nucleus. So the ER helps to function in synthesis, which remember is our fancy science word for making things or building things, and transport. So the ER plays a big role in transporting different products around the inside of the cell. So we're going to start off talking about the rough ER. It's called the rough ER because all these little bumps on the surface of it are ribosomes. So ribosomes are the tiny little protein factories in the cell. So a lot of the proteins in your cell are made by these ribosomes that are on the rough ER. So the reason why there's all these ribosomes on the ER is that directly after they are made, directly after they're produced by the cell, the ER will take them and ship them somewhere else. Specifically, if it's the rough ER, a lot of times it'll make proteins that are either going to go into the membrane. So we talked about there's some proteins that like to hang around in the membrane, or that are actually going outside of the cell to go do stuff in the bloodstream or in other cells somewhere else. So directly after the protein is made by the ribosome, it can be shipped off by our rough ER. So it's rough because of all the ribosomes on it. The ribosomes make proteins, which are then directly shipped off by the rough ER. So basically, directly after the proteins are made, they then kind of move through these interior tubes here, where they're essentially like processed and then shipped out around the cell. So our other type of ER is called smooth ER. Now the smooth ER is called smooth ER because it is smooth, meaning that it does not have ribosomes that are covering all over its surface. Right, rough ER's got all these little dotted ribosomes, all bumpy around here. Smooth ER is these nice, big, smooth tubes. Sometimes the smooth ER is attached to part of the rough ER. Sometimes it's kind of like floating in the cytoplasm nearby, so pretty close by. It helps ship stuff around inside of the cell. So the rough ER likes to send things to the edge of the cell or outside the cell. The smooth ER likes to send things to different areas inside of the cell. So they're both involved in like shipping stuff around the cell. It just kind of depends which type of ER it'll go through, depends on where that protein or other material needs to go. So besides proteins, the smoothie R also makes extra lipids that are going to go up to the membrane. And certain cells, like muscle cells that are regulating a lot of calcium, the smoothie R helps to kind of store and release those nutrients and minerals and stuff like that. And in other cells, it helps break down and destroy toxic substances. We're going to talk about a different organelle that does a lot more of this kind of stuff later on. But the smoothie R does some of it too. So it does help make and produce some components for the cell. But the big thing it does is then it sends them where they need to go. So it's sort of like local shipping, essentially. Whereas the rough ER would be like out of state or international shipping. All right, so those are our ER. There's the rough one and the smooth one. They tend to happen kind of right next to the nucleus inside of the cell, and they're used to ship proteins and lipids and other molecules inside and outside of the cell. All right, any questions about our ERs, either the rough or smooth ER? All right, not hearing anything. Sophia's all good. Sorry if it seems like I'm going a little bit fast through some of this stuff. But we just have a ton of organelles to get through, and I want to make sure that we get through all of them before the end of class today. Luckily, I think we're making pretty good time so far. So at the end, if we need to, I can go back and go through some stuff. All right, up next are some things that we've kind of talked a little bit about already, and those are the ribosomes. So the ribosomes are structures inside of the cell. They're made of protein and a special type of nucleic acid called rRNA. The little r stands for ribosome. So the ribosomes are the protein factories for the cell. If the mitochondria is the power plant, the ribosomes are the protein plants. They are what take all those little individual amino acids and put them together into the big protein. So here is a basic amino acid over here. And a ribosome is going to take dozens or hundreds or thousands of these amino acids and put them together into this big chain and fold it up and turn it into a protein. If you ever take Bio B here at the Excel Center, you'll hear all about exactly how the information from the DNA gets to the ribosome and is turned into a protein from all these amino acids. Right now, all you have to need to know is that ribosomes are where the proteins are made. So, it got cut off by the picture a little bit here. It's a process called protein synthesis, because that's just a fancy science way of saying we're making proteins. There we go. So we're making proteins inside of the ribosomes and if you remember, proteins were one of our 4 macromolecules, and their monomer, their building blocks, are these amino acids, like this guy right here. So a bunch of the ribosomes inside of your cell are attached to the rough ER. But a lot of them are also freely floating and unattached in the cytoplasm. So you don't have to be attached to the rough ER if you're a ribosome. You can just as likely end up floating around in the cytoplasm, unattached to anything, just kind of on your own. Remember, ribosomes are one of the few things that both prokaryotes and eukaryotes have. So prokaryotes, like bacteria, also have to make proteins out of DNA. So they only have the free-floating type, though, because they don't have any organelles to attach to. So both prokaryotes and eukaryotes have ribosomes. Eukaryotes tend to have a lot more ribosomes, and they can be attached to our rough ER, like we've been talking about. Ooh, up next is another one of my favorite ones to talk about. So this funky looking, squash looking guy over here is called a Golgi body. Why is it called a Golgi body? I do not know. Like most things in science, it was probably an old white man who discovered it, and his name was Golgi. And so he just slapped his name on it, and now everybody has to call it a Golgi body. I don't know if that's true or not, but that is my best guess for how they ended up with this funky looking name. But it's a lot of fun to say, so I like talking about them. So Golgi bodies are these big stacks of kind of like these flattened or squished sacs. A lot of times people refer to them as looking like a big like stack of pancakes that's been smushed together. So Golgi bodies are also really important for shipping things around the cell. Sometimes after like a protein or a enzyme leaves from the ER, it'll head over to the Golgi body, and then after that be shipped where it needs to go, inside or outside the cell. So the two different sides of it are called the cis face, is where it receives the products from the ER or from the cell. And then the trans face is where those products leave and go out and are shipped out to the rest of the cell or outside the cell in a lot of cases. So it gets a lot of packages from the ER, especially a lot of proteins that are made from the ER get shipped here to the Golgi body. And then it transports these proteins and other structures in things called vesicles. So vesicles are like these little blobs right here. And they're basically like tiny little pockets of cell membrane. So normally our cell membrane is that big structure that surrounds the entire cell, or there's some organelles that have a cell membrane around them as well. These vesicles are like tiny little cell membrane blobs that contain these important proteins or carbohydrates or whatever it is. And the Golgi body uses those to send the proteins to where they need to go. So they're part of the shipping process. So yeah, like these guys right here would be these little transport vesicles, these tiny little cell membrane bubbles, essentially. So people have referred to it as, like I said, like a stack of pancakes or like a flat stack of like smushed down pancakes. So it takes all sorts of different materials, a lot of times directly from the ER. It can modify them, it can sort them, it can package them and send them away. It can store them inside of the Golgi or inside of the cell itself. All sorts of different things for the Golgi bodies. Oh, Angelica, don't say that. They just look like pancakes, but they're really super duper tiny inside of your cells. They will not interfere with your ability to enjoy pancakes, I guarantee it. So a whole bunch of different jobs kind of done by the Golgi body, but it all sort of falls under this like sorting and transporting umbrella. So I think, let me see, sometimes these animations work okay and sometimes they don't. Let me see if I can like restart it if that'll. Sophia, yes, where are we at? There we go. This top picture over here is essentially what they actually look like inside of the cell. So this would be like an electron microscope picture of a Golgi body inside of a cell. Let me see if I can bring up that little animation somewhere else because it's really, really cool. And I think it really helps illustrate what exactly is kind of a lot of these different processes. Here we go. I'm gonna work on here. Oh, yes. Okay. Okay, so now we have to go here and do this and do this and do this and this and this. Oh, sweet, it's showing up. Okay. So we can see we have our nucleus over here. We have our ribosomes and our rough ER over here. And we've got our Golgi body over here. And here, this red part is our little protein that's being shipped along. So the protein is made by the ribosomes. It goes through the rough ER and gets modified and then gets shipped in these little vesicles to the Golgi. The Golgi then processes it and ships it out. And this particular protein is going to leave the cell. So these little vesicles, these little cell membrane bubbles, can fuse to the outside cell membrane and release the protein to the outside of the cell. And so ribosome makes the protein. Rough ER does the initial modifying and transporting, sends it to the Golgi, where it goes through the final stages and then is finally shipped out of the cell. And it's these little vesicles that it's moving in. So we're in a little vesicle here. And then we go through the Golgi, and then we go through a little vesicle to the outside of the cell, and then peace out from there. All right. Cool stuff. And now we got to go back to you. Stop, and then you. We are now going to present back to over here. There we go. Excellent. So those are our Golgi bodies. One particular organelle that I wanted to talk on that's one of the main differences between plant and animal cells is the presence of this large central vacuole. So a vacuole is basically a little storage shack inside of the cell. Some animal cells have vacuoles. They tend to be really pretty small. Plant cells have a very big vacuole. So it sometimes is one of the only organelles that's even bigger than the nucleus. Obviously, since it's an organelle, there is no vacuoles in bacteria because they're prokaryotes, and prokaryotes do not have organelles. But in plants, we got this really big kind of central holding area for a bunch of different nutrients and minerals and resources that the plant cell might need in the future. So things like sap, so like the sugar that's produced as plants go through photosynthesis. They can also store proteins, minerals, lipids, salts, enzymes, water, waste products from the cell. A whole bunch of different storage options for your plant cell inside of these big central vacuoles. Again, animal cells, they sometimes have vacuoles, and when they do, they tend to be pretty small and hard to notice. Plant cells, very big. All right, another one of my favorite organelles to talk about are the lysosomes. So lysosomes are basically like the demolition crew or the cleanup crew of the cell. So lyse is like a fancy science word for breaking stuff or breaking down stuff. So like if you remember with our macromolecules, the way that they are broken up is called hydrolysis. So the lysis in hydrolysis is similar to the lyso in lysosomes. It has to do with breaking down or separating large particles. So the lysosomes go around the cell and basically help clean up extra food, any bacteria that have invaded the cell and need to be gotten rid of, any like old enzymes that aren't really working anymore, or old organelles that need to be kind of reduced and recycled. That's what the lysosome is there for. It also helps with what's called programmed cell death or autolysis. So some cells are supposed to like expire after a certain amount of time, or they're supposed to die off in different events. And so the lysosomes help with that as well. So they're basically these little like clusters of really powerful digestive enzymes. And so they'll open up and release these enzymes that'll go and break down these different cell parts or food parts. And then when they're done, they'll kind of circle back up and contain the enzymes again. And so they help to break down and clean up and keep the cell safe and healthy on the inside. They help get rid of waste. They help break down food. They help kill invaders. They help with recycling old organelles and old enzymes. All sorts of that stuff happens thanks to our lysosomes. They tend to be pretty small organelles. Like if you see them in pictures, they're just kind of like little bubbles or little circles, kind of similar to ribosomes or those vesicles we were looking at earlier. So I think this used to be a video. Now it doesn't work so well. But essentially a cell, like if there's a food particle that it needs to get, it will like envelop and take in that food. So that's what phagocytosis means. It means like the cell will kind of like swarm its membrane around the food particle and surround it and take it inside the cell. And then the lysosome swoops in and breaks down that food. All right. Oh, we're making pretty good time. Let's see. One of the last organelles we're going to talk about, and one of the biggest differences between plant and animal cells, are chloroplasts. So we've talked about cell walls help give plant cells protection and stability. Vacuoles help plant cells store material, but chloroplasts are really what make plant cells plant cells. So they're only found in plants and other producers, things that can produce their own energy, usually from the sun. And they contain a pigment called chlorophyll, which is green, which is why a lot of plants are colored green. And this is where photosynthesis happens. So the chlorophyll inside of the chloroplast is what allows photosynthesis to happen. This is where the plants take the energy from the sun and use it to create their own food, create their own sugar in the form of glucose. So they turn that sunlight energy into chemical energy. And then later, the mitochondria will turn that sugar chemical energy into ATP chemical energy. But the chloroplasts are where this happens. This is what allows plants to be producers, to make their own food just by sitting in the sunlight for a few hours a day. You don't really have to know any of these specific details about chloroplasts. They're where photosynthesis happens, like I was saying, and they are not in animal or bacterial cells. Obviously, they're not in bacteria because chloroplasts are an organelle, and bacteria are prokaryotes that don't have organelles, but only found in plants. Chloroplasts are only in plants, never in animal or bacterial cells. Obviously, if you are hungry and you try to get full by going and standing in the sun for a couple hours, it's not going to help a whole lot. You're probably going to get a little bit of a sunburn and be even hungrier than you were when you went out there, right? We cannot make our own food from sunlight. We have to eat other things to get food. We are consumers. Plants have chloroplasts. Plants can do photosynthesis. Plants can make their own food using sunlight. Let me think. Actually, yeah, we can finish up with this. All right. So the final thing that I wanted to mention when it comes to cells and the different parts of cells and the different sizes of cells is that the reason why cells are so small, even eukaryotic cells are still microscopic small, is because there is a definite size ceiling, a definite size limitation that cells have. So the surface area of the cell, like how much plasma membrane they have, essentially, you can figure it out if you're able to like lay the cell out flat and do length times width. That would be how much plasma membrane surface area is on the cell. The volume of the cell, though, how much internal space the cell has. Obviously, it's like if you're measuring the inside of like a cabinet or a dresser or something like that. So it's length times width times height, essentially. We're pretending like these cells are boxes. But this means that as the cell gets bigger, the volume of the cell is going to go up way faster than the surface area of a cell. So as a cell grows, its volume is going up exponentially faster, meaning extremely, like, depending on the size of the cell, 2, 3, 4, 5, 10 times faster than the surface area. So as cells get bigger, even though they don't have as much coverage, they're getting a lot more size on the inside. So why is that important when it comes to how big cells can get? It means that that surface area is really important, right? Because we're taking stuff in through the cell membrane, we're sending it out through the cell membrane. If the volume of the cell gets too big compared to the surface area, then it's really hard for the cell to send all the proteins and macromolecules and stuff to where it needs to go, right? It starts to take too long for things to get from place to place inside of the cell, and it's hard to get enough food and water inside and outside of the cell, because the food and water comes in through the surface, through that plasma membrane. But then if it's constantly having to travel these relatively long distances inside of the cell, then the cell isn't operating very efficiently and could actually start to break down or even die if it gets too big. So when it does reach a certain size, the cell will start to go through division. So remember, the cell theory says that all cells are produced from other cells. We have to have a starting cell to grow and divide in order to make new cells. So when a cell starts to get too big, it will divide, which means it reduces its surface area by a little bit, but reduces its volume by a lot. It cuts it in half, essentially. So then the two new smaller cells can start growing and growing and growing again until it's their turn to divide. So for the most part, most cells inside of a single organism are fairly close in size. You might get a little bit of variation, like nerve and muscle cells tend to be really kind of long and skinny, whereas skin cells tend to be like a little bit thicker and deeper. But for the most part, there's not a huge amount of variation in the sizes of the cells of different organisms. Whew. Well, guys, I think we have made it. Ooh, and with a little bit of time to spare as well. Awesome. So, trying to think of the major organelles that we hit. We talked about the nucleus that contains the DNA. We talked about the cell membrane that controls stuff going in and out of the cells. We talked about the mitochondria, our powerhouse of the cell. The ER, which ships stuff around the cells, including to the Golgi bodies, which also does shell protein modification and shipping. We talked about those little bitty ribosomes that are floating around and making the proteins inside of your cells. We talked about the lysosomes, which are going around and breaking stuff down and helping keep your cells clean and healthy. And we talked about the chloroplasts, those plant cell only structures which are responsible for making the sugar that eventually will get turned into energy inside of the cell. So a whole lot of different structures that we just went through in a relatively short amount of time. So does anybody have any questions about any of these organelles? Anyone in particular that you're still a little bit confused about, or that you want me to go back and talk about a little bit more? All right, yeah, Angelica, I know. A bunch of info in here, for sure. All right. So, for the homework, the assignment for today and tomorrow, I kind of tried to distill it down into some of the most important structures that we talked about for the cells tonight. So today's assignment and Monday's assignment look pretty similar to each other. I have a kind of blank outline of a cell and different parts of a cell that have these little arrows pointing to. And for each arrow on here, I want you to tell me what is the name of the organelle or the structure that is being pointed to, and what is the function of this organelle. So today's assignment only has 3 organelles. We have organelle A right along here, organelle B down here, and organelle C right here. And so for each one of these, I want you to just tell me what is it and what does it do? What's kind of its main function for the cell? And then Monday's assignment is basically the same thing with a new set of organelles. So we have this A and this B and this C and even these little D's right here. But exact same structure of questions. For each arrow, I want you to tell me what's the name of this organelle and what is its function? What is kind of the main thing that it does for the cell? If you're having a hard time kind of reading the arrows, or you're not sure exactly like where in the cell they are pointing to, then please reach out to me, send me an email or a text and let me know, and I can hopefully clarify it for you a little bit. I tried to make it as clear as possible when I was creating the labels and the images, but if you're a little bit confused about what an arrow is pointing to, just reach out to me and I'll do my best to clear it up for you. All right, any final questions about today's assignment or Monday's assignment or anything that we've talked about so far dealing with cells today? No. All right, cool. Thanks, Sophia. Let's see here. Where are we going? This button, and then also this button.